Happy hump day, everybody, and welcome back inside the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Lab. That is the Flippin' Steele Show. Today's episode features a look into Steele's second draft of the season. We're breaking down his team and all the random and red flag picks of this most recent draft so you know what to do in yours. Let's get right to it.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to your show, everybody. It is the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, Wednesday edition. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. And today's listen is a bit of an extra special one. It's time for another breakdown of a draft from Steele and I. This time it's Steele's second draft of the season, people. Preseason hockey arrived this past weekend, and that means we're only a few weeks away, so draft season is in full swing. And we need to take a look at what's going on. I want to know what Steele's doing. We're going to have a look at what happened in this draft so that you can also know what to do, what not to do, because Steele, this was a bit of an interesting one. You were texting me over the weekend, some interesting results, some interesting picks. So I'm intrigued to see what your team shook out to and some of these red flags that we got to flag for our listeners out there, because I don't know what was happening in this draft. But why don't you set the table for, the format and where you were selecting and everything else our listeners need to know?
Yeah, so first, let's look at this by team. So I'll just click on this and we'll look at the teams themselves and we'll go all the way down to mine so we can see who I drafted in which round and at which pick. So my first overall pick, Nikita Kucherov, then Victor Hedman, Artemi Panarin, Thatcher Demko in round 4, Jack Eichel, Devin Taves, Jordan Binnington, Philip Forsberg, Tim Stützle, Nikolai Ehlers, Matthew Barzal, Brock Besser, Ryan Hartman, Tony DeAngelo, Gustav Forsling, and I took a couple of shots in the dark with my last 3 picks, which 2 of them you and I have talked about. First one, Alex Newhook, Jack Quinn, and I finished off with Alexander Romanov on the back end to have an extra defenseman on my bench as well. But this is a head-to-head categories format for this fantasy hockey draft. So 11 categories: goals, assists, special team points, plus minus, shots on goal, hits, blocks, and then for the goalies, it's save percentage, goals against average, and wins. I don't believe there's any shutouts in this league, which I voted against. I think there should be shutouts, but that's just how it ended up going. So only 3 categories for the goalies and 8 categories for the forwards and defensemen, but 11 categories overall. And essentially, it's just head-to-head categories. If you win, if you go 6-4-1 that week, that's what your record is for the week 1. And then it kind of just adds up by that. But that's the format of this fantasy league. That was the team I drafted. I believe there's 21 spots or 18 spots, but I think we should go back to looking at the draft recap by the round. So round 1, round 2, and I sent you a message, Flip. Yeah, I sent you a message. Igor Shesterkin taken first overall in this draft. I was absolutely shocked. I actually couldn't believe what I just witnessed. An absolute, complete utter to a start in a fantasy draft, and then followed up by Austin Matthews, which in my opinion, it's not a bad pick, but it's just the wrong pick, because how do you not pick Connor McDavid if the first overall pick passed up on him? It was absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, there's some interesting things going on here in this draft. And I think the main takeaway for today's episode in general, listeners, watchers, however you're digesting this fantasy content, is there are a lot of ways that this draft can also throw a loop in your plans. Because as much as Shesterkin going first overall there doesn't make any sense, then all of a sudden look at what happens to the rest of that first round. And I think you can ream off for our listeners in a sec how the rest of that first round shook out. But this is one of those things that you need to be prepared for. Curveballs will come your way, and maybe it doesn't mean so much for the second, third, and fourth rounds, but that first round can get messy, and it will have reverberations through the rest of your draft. So we know that Igor Shesterkin is a top goaltending option. But when you're looking at the categorical breakdowns, taking a goalie at the first overall pick, when you have guys like McDavid, McKinnon, Draisaitl, and even Matthews, Kirill Kaprizov on the board, it doesn't make any sense, Steele. So why don't you also ream off how the rest of that round went after the Shesterkin madness at the top?
Yeah, and I also want to add as well as this is why it's also important to show up to your fantasy draft, because I'm almost positive that this first overall pick man did not show up. He was auto drafting for the first half of the draft, and honestly, I don't know why Shesterkin was ranked number 1 on this draft list, but on ESPN. But that's how it just went. He never showed up. It auto drafted for him. That's why Shesterkin went first. So that was the surprise. McDavid going 3rd overall was a very big surprise. He should have been first. Honestly, Andre Vacileski at 7. We talked about waiting a little bit for goalies to go. So again, another goalie going high in the first round. Another goalie as well, who you said that might be the worst pick of the draft, Darcy Kemper, 10th overall.
Stop it.
I was not a huge fan of this. That's really, really high in my opinion, but that's just how it went. There was a lot of surprises. Alexander Ovechkin, 11th overall in the first round. I think he's a second round pick. He's still a great fantasy asset. He fits all the categories that you really need in a goal scorer and a forward, but first round was a little bit high. I would have waited for the high or mid second round selection. And then, to finish it off, Jakob Markstrom again. I know he's the 3rd or 4th best goalie in the league right now. He had some great stats last season, but to go in the first round, 14th overall, when you have Huberdeau, Mikko Rantanen, Steven Stamkos, Mika Zibanejad, guys who we talked about who are going to be electric this year, I was very surprised by that.
There's a lot that we're going to talk about after the break. We're going to get to more reactions and more breakdowns of Steele's team. We're doing this, people, so that you know what to do with yours. There is only a few weeks left to official puck drop on the NHL regular season. It is amazing to see the preseason hockey back. I have some hot takes from what I've seen so far in the preseason. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Steele alluded to the Washington Capitals. There's some injury news, some developments coming out of some of these teams. We got a big signing from the Florida Panthers. We're going to get to those pieces of news as well. But we got to pay these bills, and that starts at betonline.net. BetOnline.net is your number 1 source for football betting and info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sport wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. We are diving into the second fantasy draft that I have had so far this summer, heading into the fall season. NHL games right around the corner, Flip. You talked about it. We've teased it a little bit. But let's get back into this draft that I just had over the weekend.
Yeah, this Darcy Kemper thing is driving me a little wild. I don't know.
It was completely shocking, Flip. I can't believe that he went this high.
Look, the Shesterkin thing doesn't make sense, but at least I can understand where someone is coming from. Clearly, this person got burned in the past by not having any goaling numbers. Like, maybe that's a guy last year who he lost out by one statistical point in the categories of the goalies. Because that one, okay. Darcy Kuemper, I'm going to say this. I know I mentioned about overreactions and early reactions to the preseason Steele. The Washington Capitals are in tough this year. And I understand Tom Wilson sounds like he might be coming back a little bit earlier. He's ahead of schedule, with the return from his injury. That's something to keep an eye on for sure. But this Washington Capitals team, it just doesn't smell right for me. I know they have the big injury to Backstrom as well. Kuemper is coming off a good year. Let's not get that twisted. He was also good enough when it mattered most for the Colorado Avalanche in the playoffs. I do not want to take away from a guy who just won the Stanley Cup. That's just called throwing hate. But the setup that he's going to have in Washington this year, I really do think he's going to see a lot more rubber. And I don't think that he has that cushion of 5 or 6 or 7 goals a night from the juggernaut offense that is the Colorado Avalanche, Steele. So taking him in the first round just doesn't make any sense. I hope you have some money in this pool because you might be collecting these guys' money very early on.
Yeah, and overall, I was really happy with the outcome of my fantasy draft. And I think that's where we should kind of head to next is looking at these first 3 picks that I've made as well. Nikita Kucherov, Victor Hedman, which I've talked about. I always try to pair up a guy, a top forward and a top defenseman with one of my first to 5 round picks, trying to pair up defenseman and forward top tier. It can kind of bounce off one another on power plays, special teams, whatever it is, even just 5-on-5. Those guys are going to be finding each other every single time they're on the ice. So I want your opinion, Flip. Nikita Kucherov, 9th overall in the first round. Victor Hedman, 6th overall in the second round. And Artemi Panarin, 9th overall in the third round.
So another one of the takeaways that I had from watching a little bit of too much of preseason hockey was how good the New York Rangers have already looked. And I understand it's 2 preseason games. Some teams have not even played 2. The Rangers look good. The Rangers look good at the end of the regular season last year, even in losing. So, and there was a clip that I saw today of John Miller giving Keandre Miller props at the end of the season last year. Some of these pieces for the New York Rangers, the Philip Hedels of the world, the Keandre Millers of the world, that's how good this team is. They're deep. So, number one, love the Artemi Panarin selection. You know my thoughts on Chris Kreider. I don't think he touches 50 goals, but he can still have a good season and score 30. That's still a good year for him. We just have the red flags out, people. Don't take him too early. But Artemi Panarin has 90-plus point ability. I could see him also, I don't know, speaking, not to get off on a sidebar. You know I love my sidebar conversations. A lot of news about Patty Kane coming out of Chicago over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
He talked very clearly about, don't believe all that hype that happened. I wasn't close to leaving. And then a week later, what comes out? His top 3 destinations. And of course, the New York Rangers are right at the top. So if Patrick Kane somehow finds his way to the New York Rangers this year, all of those offensive pieces become elite, Steele. And I'll stop my rambling on here because I think I said to you 2 of my concerns with your team. Number 1, I was worried about the output of Devin Taves. And number 2, I'm a little bit worried about Nikita Kucherov's health. You can't go wrong taking a guy with his offensive ability. That's clear. I'm not going to try and take away from that because the Tampa Bay Lightning also are going to score goals this year. But my one concern there is his longevity. That's it. But other than that, come on, Nikita Kucherov has been one of the most consistent offensive producers over the last number of seasons.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you that there is the risk there, but I think you obviously being in the first round, at that point in the draft, Nikita Kucherov was the best option. And
he's going to get sniped up right after as well.
He's going to be, he would have been,
if you don't take him,
taken 10th overall.
Yeah, if you don't take him, someone's going to grab him
early. But and I understand the consideration of the injuries that he's dealt with the last couple of seasons. But looking back at his stats, like for the most part, besides 2020 when he missed the entire season, which was only 56 games anyway because of COVID, and he missed about 30 something games last year as well for injury. Before those 2 seasons of dealing with those injuries, for the most part, on average, he's only missed like 6 or 7 games a season. So if he can get back to a full healthy game, and that's another hot take I want to mention, I think he plays more than 75 games this upcoming season.
That is a hot take.
It's a hot take, but if he can play more than 75 games, which I do expect him to, he's right up there with Connor McDavid with, for the scoring leaders in the league right now. He had 128 points that, just 4 seasons ago. So if he's a healthy player, we know that he can move the puck around. We know he can take clappers on the hash marks. And he's a great special teams player. Yeah. I think he can get upwards of 115 points if he's healthy.
That is a bold take. If he's healthy, okay, I could see it. I don't think it's fair. I could see McDavid scoring 135 this year, so I don't think he's going to be in that conversation because I also would say this. 90 points from Kucherov this year is still a great season. It's still good fantasy output as well. Because lastly, I believe I'm seeing 12 teams in this league. 9th selection out of this spot is potentially my least favorite spot in that whole draft. You got a tough drafting position, if we're being honest, because I really like if it's a 12 team. I know people hate on the first spot. I'm liking that second or even third spot, or I love the bottom spot in snake draft Steele. I love to be able to fire off 2 picks at a time, the whole draft long. So there's some of those things to be said. Those are my personal preferences.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to taking more of a look at your team right after the break, because I'm going to give you a couple more of my analysis for Steele's team. And there's a couple more of these breakdowns that we have to raise, because people, if you're not paying attention and focusing right now, this is where your money gets made in these lead up to your draft. My big time draft is coming up next weekend. We're going to break that down as well next week. Make sure you keep it tapped right here. And if you've missed any of our videos, you know where to find us. It's all loaded up on YouTube. Make sure you check it out, because it will help you with your draft, people. Come on.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. Hit the follow button. And once again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Big Flip Livingstone and Steele Roden. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get back right into the draft.
Loving this draft conversation, Steele. I'm loving it. Where did you go after those 3 picks? Because, like I said, 9th selection here in this layout can get tricky. So I think I like what you did to maneuver here, because 9th is a bit of a tough hand.
Yeah, and I actually messaged my buddy right after the draft, and I was like, this is the first time in 4 or 5 years where I wasn't given or hadn't gotten the 4th overall pick in the draft. So to my shock, I was 9th overall. We did that in our first mock draft too. I think you were 9th overall in a 12-team league. So I kind of got that quick experience of being in that spot that I've never really been in before. But right after, in round 4, I had to pick my goalie. I had to go out. And I messaged you after this. There was 10 goalies taken in the first 3 rounds. Like, they were going one after another. It was absolutely insane. So I had to jump out. And for me, I think that Thatcher Demko, we talked about him. You really sold me on him as well, that I think he can have that kind of good season for me. So I never really I've never really gone to Thatcher Demko or thought about taking him in the 4th round of a draft. But at that point, you sold me on him. I really thought that he could be that wall, that stone for me in the crease. And then in round 5, I had Jack Eichel, and round 6, I had Devin Taves.
Yeah, and I think I also said this because, and not to jump around on your selections, Thatcher Demko, 100% love it. And then I think you had to go with Jordan Binnington. And this is what happens. This is what happens in drafts. If goalies go off the board early, they tend to go in concession. It happens, it happens in any draft. It happens in baseball drafts when catchers start to get drafted. It happens in NFL drafts when QBs start to go. Other GMs start to snipe up the same position. That's what happened to you. And my concern with your team a little bit is the Jordan Binnington factor. It's a bit of a question mark this year in St. Louis. I love Thatcher Demko. No question mark there. I think you got him at a steal of a round as well. Also, little tidbit, preseason, Andrei Kuzamenko getting a ton of looks on the top power play unit in Vancouver over their first couple of games and practices. Andrei Kuzamenko and the Vancouver Canucks in general, Steele, Demko or otherwise, there are a lot of intriguing fantasy pieces. If you missed that episode where we took a look at the Canucks, we did that in detail. But yeah, I could see, depending on that blue line in front of him, Steele, I could see 30, 40 wins for Demko, regularly. It really depends on what happens with this Vancouver Canucks team.
I think it really does. And we talked about it on that episode of, the Canucks really trying to bolster that blue line because, besides Quinn Hughes, there's not really anyone I'm impressed by. I know Oliver Ekman-Larsson is on a massive contract and he's not really living up to that expectation. So we already talked about that. Go check out that episode if you want to learn more information about the Canucks fantasy-wise. But for me, I think not the steal of the draft, but one of my favorite picks was Jack Eichel in round 5. I talked about him. Yeah. I still don't think the Vegas Golden Knights are going to make the playoffs, but I do think he is going to have a bounce-back season and get back into that form that we saw back when he was with his first couple of seasons with the Buffalo Sabres before, the injury he had on his neck. So for me, I really like Jack Eichel. I know you weren't a fan of Devin Taves, but we already had that conversation. I think because he's still playing on one of the best teams in the NHL, not the best, but one of the best, he's still going to have a great offensive production as well. And then you talked about here, round 7, Jordan Binnington. And I already know your thoughts on this, but again, I had to go with another starting goaltender. Again, so many goalies were off the board. Like Elvis Merzlikins was taken 5 spots ahead of me. There were so many goalies taken early, and I really wanted a starting goaltender as my backup in my league. Plus, we're only allowed drafting 2 goalies. I totally forgot about that rule. We were only allowed drafting 2 goalies. We're not allowed a third on our bench because of how many teams we have in this league and because of what happened a couple seasons ago when there was 3 or 4 goalies on one team at one point.
And that is an interesting point to highlight for the listeners out there is how many goalies do you have in your league? Because if you do have the opportunity to have a third, and I think you've mentioned that before as well, Steele, you need to keep in mind how late you do take that third option because we know injuries are going to happen. And if you don't have a third option, thankfully Steele didn't need one in this one because, Binnington, I think he's going to be better. And the Blues are good enough to carry him even if he does struggle.
I think so too.
We saw him struggle at times, but the Blues are a solid team. And I want to talk a little bit, to wrap up this show, Steele, because I see some picks on your roster here. Stützle, Ehlers, Barzal, Besser is now injured. We can talk about that. But what I want to talk about is how you finished your draft.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people focus on the top. They focus on the middle. But where they need to focus is on those last couple of rounds because people usually either some auto draft, some stop paying attention. And if you can snipe the right guy in the right round, it can really make or break your season. So I'm intrigued to see what you did in your last 3 rounds because something tells me I'm going to like it.
Yeah, at some point in the draft, and I really think it was after I selected Devin Taves that I was just really going heavy on selecting those top tier forwards. I just put it in the back of my mind. I'm going to go heavy forward wise and just pick up the remainder of my defensemen later in the draft. And that's sort of what I did again with my last 4 picks. Gustav Forsling in round 16, who again, I've talked about. I truly believe he's going to be on the top line with Aaron Ekblad. I know he's not going to be on the first power play, maybe even not even the second power play, but he's going to be playing with Aaron Ekblad and he has a ton of
Florida's going to score a ton of goals.
Mentorship. And Florida's still going to score a ton of goals. So I like Gustav Forsling at that spot. This was a risky one. Dark Alexander Romanov. He only had 10 points last year with the Montreal Canadiens. I've talked about the New York Islanders being a little bit better. I don't know if his offensive put out is going to be there, but the blocks, the hits, a decent amount of shots on goal, I can expect those categories from him, but I don't really know about his offensive production. And then to finish off, Alex Newhook, who I really, really like. We've talked a lot about him. And then a guy who I really like, and I think he's going to get a ton of opportunity at 20 years old. He's on the 3rd lineup projections right now. I can see him getting to the top 6 even. He has that much of, skill ability and talent to bring to this Buffalo Sabres team. And that's Jack Quinn in the last round, 18.
Yeah, the Romanov one, I'm not as sure of because we just also don't know how they're going to, we know he's going to take a lot of minutes in New York, but Again, New York is one of those teams that are lack of movement this offseason. If they had Nas in the mix, I'm ready to full on say they're going to be a dark horse in the playoffs. I don't know if they're going to score any goals this year, Steele. So I'd be a little bit worried if, Romanov even scrapes together 20 or 30 points, but we will see. Your other 2 selections, though, because Jack Quinn could be in the mix with all kinds of interesting good players. Dylan Cousins, Peyton Krebs, Alex Tuck. Does he get slotted all the way up the lineup? That might be bold, but who knows? He has some talent. Jack Quinn, Alex Newhook. Those are the types of players that you should be filling out your draft with because don't fall victim to just taking a name because they still have a name. You and I have brought that up at length. This is where you can find some real diamond in the rough. I love Jack Quinn. I like Alex Newhook even more. So, hey, Steele, I'm just ready to get some drafts in myself, and I think you and I might need to start teasing here, and we'll get some listener feedback. But if you want to be in a league this year with Steele or I, let us know. Hit us in the DMs. Drop a comment because Steele and I are thinking of opening up a fan-engaged league where Steele and I will be in there making picks, making drafts. So if you're feeling that, hit us in the comments. Drop us. Let us know because, Steele, I think that could be an interesting way to kick this season off.
I think that would be absolutely great to, really kick off our first full season as well, doing the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast. You know, we jumped in midway January, early February. We didn't really get the full season atmosphere that we could have had, but I'm really excited heading into this season. We've talked at length about fantasy. We've talked at length about future predictions. We've talked about bets. We're going to get into our big time bets. We're going to get our locks of the nights, our side bets flip. I'm super excited for this season. Man, I would be absolutely thrilled to do a fantasy based league with our listeners and viewers.
So there we go. Just came off the top of the head there. Steele's looking at me like, whoa, we didn't talk about this off air. So that's my bad. But I've been thinking about it a lot, and there's been some asking for it. So
there has been,
if you're up for it, slide in the DMs. Like I said, hit us up on Twitter. You can find us across Twitter. Hit us up and let us know, because I think that might be something we get going. Jump in a league with us. Let us know if you're interested. And yeah, thanks for tuning in for today's episode. Steele, take us away, brother.
Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast your first listen every single day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On NHL, your 30 daily minute podcast. Locked On NHL, get all the NHL news all year long. Once again, thank you so much for following and subscribing to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast. If you haven't yet, please do so right now. We've just got over 400 subscribers. The downloads are absolutely on fire right now. Thank you so much for all the love and support. Flip and I appreciate where this podcast is going, the direction we're moving in. We've seen the love and support on YouTube and on all podcast platforms. Good luck with all your bets out there, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.